Hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about aggregate demand. Now we've already looked at individual demand at the microeconomic level. Now I want to look at aggregate demand at the macroeconomic level. So we're looking at the demand for an entire economy at a certain price level. Now we've already looked at standard demand, which looks at what is the quantity demanded at a certain price for a particular good. But today we want to focus on the amount of demand in an entire economy at a certain price level. Now, aggregate demand is a very important concept in economics. We're going to be working with it a lot. Probably the most used graph in this class is called the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. And aggregate demand is a huge part of that graph. So it's really important that we understand what aggregate demand is, we understand the aggregate demand graph, we understand what can shift that aggregate demand curve. So aggregate demand shows the amount of real gross domestic product that the private, public, and foreign sector collectively desire to purchase at each possible price level. So this relationship between the price level and the level of real gross domestic product is inverse. So remember here that we are going to be taking a look at the relationship between price level and the amount of real gross domestic product that is going to be purchased at that price level. So let's take a look at an aggregate demand curve. So on your y-axis, you're always going to have PL, that stands for price level. On your x-axis, you're always going to have GDPR, that stands for real GDP. Then you're going to have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Changes in the price level are just going to move you from point to point on the curve. In fact, whenever the variable on the y-axis changes, you're just moving from point to point on a curve. And then we're also going to talk a little bit later about the determinants that can actually shift that aggregate demand curve. Now I want to talk about the three reasons that aggregate demand is downward sloping. The first one is the real balances effect. So when the price level is high, households and businesses cannot afford to purchase as much output. So you're going to have lower real GDP. When the price level is low, households and businesses can afford to purchase more output. So you're going to have higher real GDP. You also have the interest rate effect. A higher price level increases the interest rate, which tends to discourage investment because it is more expensive to borrow and invest, and a discouraging of investment is going to lower real GDP. A lower price level is going to decrease the interest rate, and that encourages investment because it is now less expensive to borrow and invest. More investment means more real GDP. Then you also have the foreign purchases effect. So a higher price level increases demand for relatively cheaper imports, because if the price level is very high within an economy, it is cheaper to go buy things from other nations. And so therefore you're going to be importing more. You're going to be exporting less. Less exports is going to lower real gross domestic product. A lower price level increases the foreign demand for relatively cheaper US exports. So a lower price level means people are going to be buying more stuff from our country because it's cheap here. That's going to create more demand for our exports. And that's going to push up real gross domestic product. Now, there are two parts to a shift in aggregate demand. The first one is going to be a change in consumption, gross private investment, government spending, net exports. You might recognize those. Those are the four components of gross domestic product. You also have what's called the multiplier effect that produces a greater change than the original change in those four components. And we're going to focus on the multiplier a little bit more at a later date. An increase in aggregate demand shifts it to the right, decrease shifts it to the left. So let's look at an increase in aggregate demand. Okay, so we have price level on our y-axis, real GDP on our x-axis. We start off with original aggregate demand. It shifts to the right to AD1. So we go from aggregate demand to aggregate demand 1. AD to AD1. So at the same price level, you're going to have a higher real GDP after you shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Decrease in aggregate demand is going to look like this. You have aggregate demand, your original aggregate demand curve, we just call that aggregate demand. Then it's going to shift to the left to aggregate demand 1 or AD1. All right, so for next video, we're going to be talking about the determinants of aggregate demand, and those will actually be the factors that will shift the entire aggregate demand curve.